What if the person you trusted most turned out to be the very one who would destroy your world? Imagine a tiny voice crying out for help, but no one hearing it in time. This isn't just any story. It's a nightmare that became real. The chilling mystery of Teghan Skiba's last moments still haunts those who knew her, and the questions surrounding her death remain painfully unanswered. On a seemingly ordinary day, in a quiet neighborhood where everyone thought they were safe, something terrible happened. Something so cruel, so heartbreaking, it shattered an entire community.
Tipping the scales, an unimaginable case. A beautiful one-year-old baby dying in a hot car.
A phone call that something was severely wrong with the baby.
Done to a human being, especially a child. Never seen anything like that.
Who could do such a thing, and why? Tonight, we dive deep into the life of a young girl stolen far too soon. A story that reveals how darkness can hide behind the brightest smiles. Stay with me, because this story will grip your heart and twist your mind. By the end, you'll never look at innocence the same way again. Teghan Skiba was just a little girl, full of life, dreams, and the innocent hope every child carries. She lived in a quiet neighborhood where families believed their children were safe, protected by love and trust. But behind closed doors, something terrible was happening, something so dark no one expected. Teghan's story isn't just about a crime, it's about betrayal, silence, and the failure of those meant to keep her safe. She wasn't taken by a stranger lurking in the shadows. The nightmare came from someone close, closer than her own family. This tragedy happened where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, where smiles hid secrets and laughter masked pain. The day Teghan's world changed was like any other, yet it ended with a horror no one could forget. Her disappearance wasn't noticed right away. Days passed in silence. When the truth finally surfaced, it shocked the whole community to its core. The girl who once ran freely and dreamed big was gone. But how did this happen? How could someone close hurt her so deeply? And why did it take so long for the world to see the truth? These questions haunt those left behind and everyone who heard her story. Today we'll explore the moments before that tragic day, the secrets hidden in plain sight. In a quiet North Carolina town, behind a rundown trailer and an old storage shed, a nightmare unfolded. No one saw it, no one stopped it. For 10 days, a little girl was hidden, out of sight, away from school, neighbors, and even family. No alarms were raised, no one knocked, no one asked, "Where is she?" And that silence would cost her everything. Her name was Teghan Skiba. Born in 2006, she was just 4 years old, too young to understand the danger, too small to defend herself, too innocent to know why she was being hurt. By the time paramedics reached her, it was already too late. Her tiny body was covered in bruises, burns, and deep wounds, some new, some healing. The abuse she suffered was so severe that even experienced doctors broke down. How could this happen? How does a child suffer in silence for so long, without anyone noticing? The answer starts with a decision, a single, irreversible decision made by the person she trusted most, her mother. In July of 2010, Teghan's mother, Alicia Skiba, left town for Army Reserve training. She needed someone to watch her daughter while she was away. Instead of asking family or close friends, she left Teghan in the care of her boyfriend, Jonathan Richardson. He wasn't Teghan's father, he wasn't family, and he wasn't safe. Jonathan lived in a trailer behind his grandparents' home in Smithfield, North Carolina. His way of caring for Teghan involved locking her in a dark, hot shed with no bed, no fan, and no protection. For the next 10 days, this little girl endured things no child should ever face. Alone, trapped, tortured. And the worst part, no one even knew she was missing. There were no missing person posters, no search parties, no community alerts. Teghan's suffering happened in complete silence, just a few feet away from where others were living their normal lives. The shed had no light, no running water, no toys, no blankets, just wood, filth, and pain. And yet, for 10 full days, no one came. When Teghan was finally brought to the hospital by Jonathan himself, claiming she fell in the bathtub, doctors were horrified. Her injuries were not an accident, they were the result of systematic, brutal abuse. The doctors said it was one of the worst cases of child abuse they had ever seen. She had bite marks, burns, head trauma, and injuries indicating repeated torture. Her brain was swelling, her body was shutting down, her spirit already nearly broken. Teghan died soon after arriving at the hospital, but her story didn't end there. It had only begun. What happened during those 10 days? What kind of man was Jonathan Richardson? Why did her mother trust him? And what warning signs were ignored? Most importantly, how did a precious, innocent child fall through every crack in the system? When a child cries behind closed doors, who's listening? The moment Alicia Skiba stepped onto the bus for her Army Reserve training, her daughter Teghan was left vulnerable and no longer safe. Alicia needed someone to watch over her little girl while she was away. Instead of turning to family or close friends, she placed her trust in Jonathan Richardson, a man with no experience raising children, no patience, and a troubling history of violent outbursts. But none of that mattered to Alicia at the time. Jonathan was now in full control, and with that control, he destroyed Teghan's life. From the outside, Jonathan's trailer looked ordinary, worn but typical for rural North Carolina. But just behind the trailer was a small wooden shed. It was old, weathered, barely fit to store a lawnmower, let alone a child. Yet that was exactly where Jonathan kept Teghan. Locked away in that cramped, suffocating space, it was the middle of a sweltering North Carolina summer. Day and night, Teghan was trapped inside with no air conditioning, no fan, no windows, and no light. The heat inside the shed was unbearable. Mosquitoes and flies buzzed relentlessly, making the air heavy and thick. This wasn't just neglect, it was punishment, and it happened every single day. Jonathan claimed he was trying to discipline Teghan, but what he did went far beyond discipline. It was cold, calculated torture. He beat her mercilessly, with cords, belts, and his bare fists. He struck her so violently that her skin split open in several places. He yanked her hair until it tore from her scalp. He bit her face. He slammed her head repeatedly against the rough wooden walls of the shed. Sometimes, he would tie her up with blankets, leaving her helpless. Other times, he simply left her there to scream in the darkness, alone and terrified. Teghan's body was a map of pain. Cuts crisscrossed her face. Deep bruises stained her neck and arms. Her skin showed burns and angry red welts. Her tiny body was swollen with scratches and fresh wounds. She begged for food, but he ignored her pleas. She cried out for help, but no one answered. She called for her mother, but no one came. We often hear about monsters hiding under beds or lurking in shadows, but sometimes the real monsters walk among us, disguised as ordinary people. Jonathan insisted Teghan was a bad child, that she needed to be taught a lesson. But what kind of lesson ends with a child's brain bleeding? What kind of punishment fractures a 4-year-old's skull and shuts down her fragile body? As the days passed, something inside Teghan began to break irreparably. She grew weaker by the hour. She couldn't stand, she vomited frequently. Her speech became slurred and incoherent. She slipped in and out of consciousness, too weak to stay awake. And still, Jonathan didn't call for help. Finally, in a moment of panic, Jonathan took her to a hospital in nearby Smithfield. He told the doctors she had fallen in the bathtub, but the medical team immediately knew the truth. This was no accident. Doctors rushed Teghan into emergency care. Her brain was rapidly swelling, and she suffered from severe internal injuries. Her skin was covered in a horrifying mix of fresh and healing wounds, clear evidence of days, not hours of abuse. One emergency room nurse later said, "We see cases of abuse, but this was different. The pain in her body was everywhere. It was in every bruise, every cut, and she was so small." Despite every effort to save her, little Teghan Skiba died on July 19, 2010. She was only 4 years old, and she didn't die from a single act of violence. She died from prolonged, repeated, intentional cruelty. It wasn't just physical abuse that destroyed her, it was psychological and emotional torment too. Every day, she was made to feel worthless, invisible, like no one would ever come to save her, and sadly, no one did. But Teghan's death was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of a dark and intense investigation, one that would uncover horrifying truths and force the entire community to ask the question, how was this allowed to happen? Who failed this innocent child? And how could a little girl suffer so much without anyone noticing? The investigation began the very moment Teghan Skiba was rushed into Johnston Memorial Hospital. From the second emergency room staff laid eyes on this fragile little girl, it was painfully clear something was horribly wrong. The severity of her injuries, the countless bruises, cuts, and wounds, they all told a grim story far beyond any typical accident. Jonathan Richardson, the man who brought her in, insisted she had simply fallen from a bunk bed. But the doctors, with decades of experience and countless trauma cases behind them, knew this was no accident. What they saw resembled something far more sinister, prolonged, deliberate torture. Quietly and urgently, the medical team stepped aside and contacted the police, setting in motion an investigation that would shock a community. When law enforcement officers arrived at the hospital that morning, they were completely unprepared for the horror awaiting them. As soon as they laid eyes on Teghan, a mere 4 years old, it was evident this was no simple injury. Her tiny body bore a gruesome map of abuse. Bruises in varying stages of healing covered her skin, some dark and faded, others fresh and swollen. Deep cuts, burns, and extensive swelling spoke of a sustained campaign of violence that could not have come from any innocent fall. Despite her critical condition, Teghan clung weakly to life, barely conscious. Every inch of her body told a silent story of suffering, pain, and terror. Jonathan Richardson, standing stiff and emotionless beside her, offered a rehearsed explanation that didn't hold up under scrutiny. He claimed she had simply fallen, but his detached demeanor and lack of genuine concern raised immediate red flags. One nurse, her voice barely a whisper, confided to a colleague, "This wasn't a fall. Someone hurt her. Someone did this to her," over and over again. That haunting statement lingered in the room like a shadow. Richardson was quickly taken into custody for questioning, while officers set off for the rural property he had given as his address, a modest trailer nestled behind his grandparents' home in Smithfield, North Carolina. The sun beat down mercilessly on the empty fields surrounding the property, and an eerie silence hung heavily over the land. What caught the officers' attention was not the trailer itself, but the small wooden shed located just behind it. Weathered and unassuming from the outside, it looked like any other forgotten outbuilding, yet the presence of a heavy lock on its door sparked suspicion. Why would a simple storage shed need to be locked from the outside? With cautious hands, the officers forced the door open, and an oppressive wave of heat greeted them like a physical blow. Inside, the shed was dark, cramped, and filthy. The air was thick and heavy, saturated with the smells of sweat, rot, and something far more unsettling, blood. No windows allowed lighter air to penetrate the suffocating space. The floor was layered with dirt and grime, and a stained mattress was shoved into one corner, its fabric worn and soiled. Ropes dangled from nails hammered into the walls, suggesting the disturbing possibility of restraints. The officers quickly realized that a child had been living here. No, not living, but enduring suffering. A child forced to sleep on a cold, bare floor, tied up and left to scream in a dark prison where no one could hear. As the search continued, the horrors multiplied. Torn underwear lay discarded in a corner. Duct tape, stained and sticky, was found rolled nearby. A plastic cup, marked with reddish-brown stains, sat atop a pile of crumpled tissues and moldy food wrappers. But the most chilling discovery came when officers uncovered a hidden video camera tucked beneath a heap of clothes. The tape inside it was intact. Back at the police station, the detectives watched the footage in stunned silence. The videos were far worse than anything they had feared. Jonathan Richardson had recorded multiple clips of the abuse. They showed Teghan, bruised and swollen, tied up and crying softly, sometimes unnervingly silent. In one clip, she pleaded quietly for water. In another, she repeated words after Richardson, clearly terrified to disobey. He paced the room, yelling, taunting, and insulting her in a voice that was not angry, but chillingly calm, like this horrific routine was just another day for him. At times, he laughed mockingly, while in others, he stared coldly into the camera, daring anyone to stop him. Further searches of the trailer revealed handwritten journals, pages filled with Richardson's twisted thoughts. He described Teghan as a demon, spoke openly about breaking her will, and documented punishment routines and pain tests as though experimenting on her. These writings were not the ramblings of a man losing control. They were the calculated notes of someone fully aware of his cruelty, and disturbingly, someone who took pleasure in it. Forensic experts performed a meticulous examination of Teghan's injuries. The results shocked even the most seasoned pathologists. Her body bore over 70 distinct wounds, bruises, lash marks, cigarette burns, and internal trauma. Her brain was swollen, consistent with repeated blows or violent shaking. Evidence of strangulation and sexual abuse surfaced, along with signs of long-term neglect and trauma. Some injuries were fresh, mere hours old. Others dated back days. This was not an isolated incident, but a relentless, systematic campaign of violence over time. And through it all, the most haunting question lingered: how had no one noticed? Neighbors hadn't raised alarms. No missing person report had been filed. No welfare checks had been conducted. Teghan had simply vanished from public view, and no one had questioned her absence. The silence around her disappearance was deafening. Investigators then turned their attention to Elisa Baker, Teghan's mother. She claimed to have left her daughter in Richardson's care while attending Army Reserve training. But when police checked, the military had no record of her attending any such training. No assignments, no deployments, nothing. She had lied. She had left her child in the hands of a dangerous stranger, abandoning her at the moment she needed protection most. The investigation revealed Elisa's disappearance from her daughter's life at the very moment Teghan needed her most. Her silence and neglect were seen as a betrayal, making her complicit in the tragedy that unfolded. Before closing their search, detectives found a small, crumpled piece of paper inside the shed, a child's drawing. It depicted a simple stick figure enclosed in a box. No sky, no sun, no flowers, just a boxed-in girl. It was Teghan's final, silent plea for help, a heartbreaking message from a child trapped in a nightmare no one tried to end. This case was only beginning, but already the chilling truth was undeniable. This wasn't just a story of abuse. It was a catastrophic failure of protection, a heartbreaking collapse of every safety net, and a dire warning about the consequences of misplaced trust. It was a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest dangers come from those we are supposed to trust the most, and that silence can be the most dangerous weapon of all. At first glance, Jonathan Douglas Richardson didn't stand out. He wasn't the kind of man who turned heads or raised immediate suspicion. Quiet and lanky, he mostly kept to himself, blending into the background of the rural North Carolina community. But behind that blank, expressionless face was something far darker, something deeply broken and dangerous. As investigators began to dig into his past, what they uncovered painted a disturbing picture of a man who was both disturbed and capable of unspeakable cruelty. Jonathan was only 21 years old when he was arrested, and surprisingly, he had no prior violent criminal record. That fact shocked many, considering the horrific nature of the abuse endured by little Teghan Skiba. There was no public warning sign, no criminal file brimming with red flags. Yet as investigators interviewed people who knew him, unsettling patterns emerged. Friends and acquaintances described him as strange and socially withdrawn, a man easily agitated and prone to sudden bursts of anger. One former friend recalled seeing anger in his eyes, while others mentioned how he would talk about pain and punishment in disturbing ways, even toward animals. But no one had ever witnessed him acting violently in public. Like many abusers, Richardson wore a mask in the outside world, calm, unthreatening, forgettable. But behind closed doors, that mask dropped. His childhood was marred by instability and turmoil. He grew up in a home dominated by a violent father and emotional neglect. Though there were rumors of abuse in his upbringing, no official records confirmed these claims. Still, those who knew him believed he had learned cruelty from a young age, absorbing the cycle of violence rather than breaking free from it. Instead of healing, he carried that darkness forward, becoming a mirror of the pain he once endured. What truly disturbed investigators was Richardson's cold, calculated approach. This wasn't a man who lost control in a moment of rage. Instead, he was methodical and deliberate. He created a routine of abuse, an almost clinical schedule. For 10 days straight, he tortured Teghan with relentless beatings, starvation, isolation, verbal degradation, and sexual assault. He wasn't just inflicting pain, he documented it. He filmed the abuse, capturing moments of her terror and submission. He wrote about it, keeping journals filled with twisted reflections, recording what broke her spirit and what made her cry. To him, this was no crime. It was a sick experiment in control and power. Psychologists later diagnosed Richardson with multiple disorders, including antisocial tendencies, extreme narcissism, and possible borderline psychosis. But even these labels fell short of explaining the depth of his cruelty. He didn't snap. He chose this darkness every day. And when Teghan's body began to fail, collapsing under the weight of brain swelling, blood loss, and internal injuries, he waited hours before seeking medical help. Not because he cared, but because he knew that if she died, he could be caught red-handed with a corpse. During questioning, he muttered, "I messed up." But there was no remorse in his voice. It was damage control, a desperate attempt to limit the consequences of his actions. And then there was the question haunting every officer involved. How did Teghan end up in his care at all? That question led investigators to Elisa Baker, Teghan's 21-year-old mother. At first, Elisa appeared to be a secondary figure, a grieving mother who made a terrible mistake trusting the wrong person. But as detectives peeled back the layers of her involvement, a far more troubling story emerged. Elisa was a young woman struggling to manage her own chaotic life. She lacked a stable job, a steady home, and according to those close to her, a strong maternal instinct. People described her as careless, distracted, and emotionally detached from her daughter. Teghan was often left in the care of various acquaintances, friends, and boyfriends for extended periods. Richardson wasn't even a long-term partner. He was someone Elisa had only recently been seeing. Yet she entrusted her 4-year-old daughter to his supervision, leaving her locked away in a shed while she claimed to be away on military training. That claim was a lie. Elisa told several people she was heading off for Army Reserve duty, even packing military gear to maintain the illusion she'd be gone for weeks. But the military had no record of her attending any training or deployment. It was a complete fabrication. Investigators later uncovered that instead of serving her country, Elisa was visiting an ex-boyfriend out of state, living a separate life, free of responsibility, while her daughter suffered in silence. Her behavior during the investigation was chillingly detached. Elisa showed little urgency or concern. Her interviews with police were mechanical and emotionless. She didn't cry, didn't demand answers, and didn't ask to see her daughter in the hospital until days had passed. And even then, her reaction was muted, unnatural for a mother. Witnesses described her demeanor as cold and disconnected, as if she was playing a role she didn't fully understand. The prosecution later argued that Elisa was more than just negligent. She was complicit through her silence and abandonment. She left Teghan in the care of a violent man in an unlivable, torturous environment without ever checking on her welfare. She didn't visit, didn't call, didn't ask for updates. She handed her daughter over and walked away, never returning until it was too late. Ultimately, investigators concluded Elisa didn't want to be a mother. Rather than protect Teghan, she abandoned her. The two people responsible for Teghan's care, one by choice, the other by blood, both failed her in every possible way. Together, their cruelty and neglect created the conditions that allowed this tragedy to unfold. One acted with brutal violence, the other with cold apathy, but both bore responsibility for the death of an innocent child who never stood a chance. This heartbreaking case stands as a stark reminder. Sometimes the greatest dangers come not from strangers, but from those we trust the most. And when silence and neglect take hold, the consequences can be devastating and irreversible. The story of Teghan Skiba is a call to vigilance, compassion, and the urgent need to protect those who cannot protect themselves. After a thorough and painstaking investigation, both suspects, Jonathan Richardson and Elisa Baker, were arrested and formally charged with crimes that shocked the community and the nation alike. The day they were brought to court was a moment that brought the small town of Smithfield, North Carolina, to a complete standstill. It was a moment heavy with emotion, grief, and anticipation as people waited to hear justice finally begin for little Teghan Skiba. Jonathan Richardson was escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs, his face eerily expressionless, showing no sign of remorse, fear, or humanity. His cold demeanor unsettled those who saw him, as if he was detached from the gravity of the crimes he was accused of committing. Elisa Baker appeared alongside him, quieter and more withdrawn, but no less burdened by the weight of the charges she faced. This moment marked the beginning of a legal battle that would lay bare the horrific truth behind Teghan's suffering, exposing every dark detail to a stunned courtroom. The trial opened with the prosecution laying out its case in unflinching detail. From the very start, they presented the jury with damning evidence that left no room for doubt. Among the most devastating pieces were the videos recorded by Richardson himself. The footage was graphic, heartbreaking, and impossible to ignore. Jurors were shown images of a frightened little girl, tied up, crying silently, and enduring unimaginable pain, all while Richardson's cold and cruel voice echoed in the background. The courtroom fell into a heavy silence during these showings, broken only by the occasional stifled sob from those unable to hold back their emotions. It was a stark, painful reminder of the depth of cruelty one human could inflict upon another. Medical experts then took the stand, providing chilling testimony about the extensive and brutal injuries Teghan had suffered. They described bruises in various stages of healing, cigarette burns, bite marks, and internal trauma so severe it caused brain swelling and ultimately death. The pediatrician's testimony was particularly heart-wrenching, detailing how the abuse and neglect had been repeated over days, slowly destroying the child's fragile body. Each word painted a clearer picture of the unimaginable suffering Teghan endured in her final days. Jonathan Richardson chose not to testify in his defense, maintaining the same cold and detached demeanor that had marked him from the beginning. The prosecution read aloud passages from his personal journals, where he chillingly described the abuse as training and expressed a twisted desire to break Teghan's spirit. The courtroom was stunned into silence once more, struggling to comprehend such a calculated and heartless mindset. The defense attempted to argue that Richardson suffered from mental illness and was therefore not fully responsible for his actions. However, the prosecution countered forcefully, emphasizing the evidence that showed his actions were methodical and prolonged, not the result of an uncontrollable breakdown. The jury deliberated carefully, but came to a unanimous verdict. Jonathan Richardson was found guilty on all counts, including first-degree murder, torture, and sexual assault. The sentence was severe but fitting, a death sentence that reflected the gravity and brutality of his crimes. The weight of the verdict was felt deeply throughout the courtroom, as it was both a moment of justice and an acknowledgement of irreversible loss. Meanwhile, Elisa Baker pleaded guilty to charges of child neglect and contributing to Teghan's death. Her failure to protect her daughter, compounded by her lies about military service, led to a prison sentence. The court recognized her role in this tragic story. Her neglect and abandonment had paved the way for the abuse to continue unchecked. Her punishment reflected society's condemnation of her cold disregard for her child's well-being. Outside the courtroom, the community was engulfed in grief and mourning. Vigils were held in honor of Teghan, with neighbors, friends, and even strangers gathering to light candles and hold pictures of the little girl whose life was stolen too soon. The pain was raw, but there was also a sense of relief that justice had been served, even if it could never undo what had happened. The trial became a painful reminder of what happens when trust is broken and protection fails those who need it most. In the weeks and months following the trial, the impact of Teghan Skiba's death rippled far beyond Smithfield. The case ignited outrage and renewed urgent conversations about child protection laws and community responsibility. How could such horrific cruelty have gone unnoticed for so long? How many systems failed Teghan before she was found? These questions sparked calls for change. Social workers, law enforcement officers, and local leaders faced pressure to improve how vulnerable children are monitored and protected, with promises to review protocols, increase training, and act faster when warning signs appear. The hope was that no other child would suffer in silence, unseen and unheard, as Teghan had. For those who worked tirelessly on the case, the detectives, doctors, nurses, and prosecutors, the memories lingered long after the courtroom emptied. Many spoke openly about the emotional toll the case took on them, describing how the images of Teghan's injuries and the haunting video evidence stayed with them, a constant reminder of why their work mattered. Some said this case changed the way they approached every investigation afterward, fueling their determination to fight harder for children who cannot speak for themselves. They became more vigilant, more compassionate, and more committed to uncovering even the quietest cries for help. Teghan's extended family and close friends faced an unimaginable loss. While Elisa Baker was held legally responsible for neglect, others in the family struggled with feelings of guilt, sorrow, and helplessness. The tragedy left wounds that could never fully heal. Every milestone Teghan would have reached, every laugh and every tear was lost forever, a stark void in the lives of those who loved her. In the end, Teghan's story became a somber but powerful lesson about the dangers of neglect and abuse, the vital importance of community vigilance, and the urgent need for stronger child protection measures. It reminded everyone that children rely on adults to be their voice and shield. And when that protection fails, the consequences can be devastating. Teghan Skiba's life, though tragically brief, shines a light on the critical need for vigilance, compassion, and action. Abuse often hides behind closed doors, silent cries masked by fear and shame. It falls on all of us, families, neighbors, communities, and authorities, to pay attention, speak up, and intervene before it's too late. If you ever suspect a child is in danger, do not hesitate to reach out to local authorities or child protection agencies. Sometimes a single phone call can save a life. Sharing stories like Teghan's is painful, but necessary. By raising awareness, we honor her memory and push for meaningful change. Let her story remind us all that protecting children is not the responsibility of a few, it is a duty we all share. If you found this video important, please like, share, and subscribe to support more stories that bring light to the darkest truths.